for the Russian elites that this is not just a war that they can finish. It is too deep for them. And their hatred of Ukraine is hopefully, although it's very strong, hopefully it's not stronger than Ukraine's will to survive and become a successful modern European nation. I will stop here. So the copies of this volume are available for free, but also I have another book of mine. Actually, that would be something my book. In contrast to this one, which is a multi-author study, this I can offer for 10 euros, which is half the price that you can find on Amazon. If you're interested in Russian political warfare, it's mostly about Russia and its propaganda and influence tactics in Europe. Thank you. And let's continue to go to another panel.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Congratulations on the very interesting volume. It's definitely worth reading, so grab your coffee, take off your coffee before you leave. And thank you also for outlining how where you find roots of Russian de facto Ukrainophobia. Let me start with a question to all three of you. There are a lot of Russian narratives in the information space, in Europe, of course in Russia. Which one of them do you think is the one that it's hardest to debunk and manages to convince more people that it might be true? And if you can answer this question in 2 short sentences, which one and and why is it so hard to debunk it? Who would like to start?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for having and inviting me. I would say for me, it's probably the myth that Russia is so-called bulwark against the Western aggression. And why it's hard to debunk, because Russia invests a lot in this and also feeds it with a lot of myths, like, for instance, this historical information. Yeah, Russia was weakened during Second World War without mentioning everything else. And then Russia is weakened now because it protects itself from, like, I don't know, NATO, US, and so on. Then it's simplification of history in geopolitics, because it's simple answer. Yeah, Russia is always defensive, Western is always offensive. And another reason that I see now more and more often, that many people believe that Russia also fights with colonial powers. And many people actually come also into Eastern European history, they know that Russia is a big colonial power which consists of many regions. They have very long history of actual resistance to Russia and Soviet Union.
Okay. Thank you. Sebastian?
Similar direction. I think one of the major narratives that is out there, especially in the German-speaking world, is that NATO did this enlargement and is threatening Russia, and they just have to defend themselves against this NATO aggression and expansionism. And I don't know why it is so hard to debunk, because it should be pretty straightforward, but like reason and common sense is not something that is very en vogue at the moment in general, but especially in political discourse. We look at declassified documents where they claim that it was even written down. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that they don't exist. It doesn't matter that, for instance, it's not compared to what you mentioned, Russia being a colonial power that forced others into their empire. And the USSR would also be, for me, then classified as an empire. But when you join NATO, you do this voluntarily. It's not that NATO, whatever that would be, comes and says, like, you have to join, we want to incorporate you. No, it's the other way around. Actually, those countries said, hey, can we get under your security umbrella, because we want protection. And then NATO decides, well, maybe we let you in. Ukraine, unfortunately, is not, and therefore is suffering this war of aggression at the moment. But why it's still able to portray itself as a victim of aggression from the side of the Russian Federation, from NATO, it's for me hard to comprehend.
I find that maybe the answer was like even what Anastasia also said, that there is a limited knowledge of Central and Eastern Europe, so people might be falling for it much easier. But maybe Anton, you have another explanation and another myth to the bank.
Well, essentially, if we consider this narrative about NATO enlargement and the West is being an aggressor, the success or relative success of this narrative is due to the fact that it feeds into the existing skepticism of the West about itself. It feeds into the skepticism about NATO. It feeds into the skepticism about the US, at least before Trump. Anti-American traditions in Europe are very deep. They are being fed by traditional anti-Americanism of France or Germany. It does exist. I mean, and it has nothing to do, in fact, with Russia. It's authentic. It is there. It's indigenous. And Russian propaganda is primarily successful when it can find those spots and exploit them. When Russians try to create something new, something that has no roots in the Western discourse, in Western debates, it usually fails to promote those narratives. It's only when it finds those weak spots, those conflicts that it can exploit. So it found this anti-NATO sentiment, anti-American sentiment, and it is exploiting it. But I must say that if we're talking about successful narratives, or most successful narratives, this is clearly about the West. This is about Europe. This is about the West in general. There are other successful narratives outside of this part of the world. The West is not the entire world. In the global South, I think the most successful narrative that Russia has is that Ukrainian people are just Russians. And what the West is doing, it is trying to get that Russian region out of Russia. Because for many in the global South, the war between Russia and Ukraine is essentially seen as white people killing white people. And who they should side with, they don't really know. And this is where Russia is really, really successful. Also building all the networks of influence that it has retained since the time of the Soviet Union. It was always present in Latin America. It was always present in Africa. It was always present in Central Asia and in Asia in general. It was called during the Cold War. It was called the developing world, the third world countries. Now it's called the global South. But Russia has always been there, while the West, in my opinion, have not been working enough with those parts of the world, and in a way lost them, not only to Russia, but also to China, India, and other important geopolitical centers. But yeah, I will agree here that yes, this narrative of NATO has been one of the most successful ones. But again, also this narrative that Russia is about peace, while the West is always militaristic and aggressive. But then again, it also goes back to the Soviet Union that presented itself as a peaceful country, and it was funding all those kind of peace movements in the West, where it could not fund the communist parties, the socialist parties. It was just fund those peace movements, and it has been documented. It's very clear that they basically using the same manual of influencing the West as they did during the Cold War.
So they were helping graduate nations by inviting them, which was the fate of Poland, and September 1939. It's also ironic actually that countries that themselves experience colonial rule, are not identifying this war in a way as having this colonial background too, right? We also see that actually depends in the different parts of the world of Europe, those stereotypes differ. Because what comes to my mind is invincible Russia. So that's something that I have seen a lot in the information space in Poland. And it's I don't think it's so difficult to debunk this myth because already Radosław Sikorski did it by showing how much stronger NATO is. If you look at the army, if you look at resources, but still maybe the vastness of Russia's territory, or maybe the fact that the population is so big makes people really believe that you can't, that Russia is invincible. Anyways, we'll still go back to some of those issues today during the discussion. Let me start with the first big round of questions, and I'm looking at you, Anton, because you already mentioned the roots of Ukrainophobia and Russian political mythology. You mentioned Putin already in the 90s talking about it and sort of seeing Ukraine as a threat just because it was a sovereign nation. But could you explore this topic, explain to us a bit more? And also show us how it has manifested itself in the years leading to the full-scale invasion, but after the annexation of Crimea.
So yeah, let me start with this political mythology. So at the core of Russian political mythology about Ukraine lies a distinction between two types of Ukrainians. One type of Ukrainians is what we call the Little Russian, Malorossi, so Little Russians. Those people, those are Ukrainians who are friendly towards Russia. In many cases, they are part of the Russian socio-political life. So they are sort of friendly towards Russia. And there is another type of Ukrainians, a type of Ukrainians which look towards Europe, Ukrainians who want to retain their national sovereignty, defend their territorial integrity, and be part of Europe or of the West. And this distinction, it is not a creation of the recent years. This distinction its roots go back to the 19th century. They were modified somehow. They were changed under different circumstances, but this distinction would be sustained. So in the 20th century, this distinction was about those pro-Soviet Ukrainians or communist Ukrainians, and those Ukrainians who wanted to be independent from the Soviet Union. And because of the rise of fascism and because of some cooperation between parts of the Ukrainian national liberation movements with the Third Reich, all Ukrainians who wanted to have their own independent nation state were immediately associated with fascists, although that was historically untrue, that all Ukrainian nationalists were part of this fascist drive. So this distinction persists, and it's also somehow for Putin and for the elites, for those people who own Russia, they know this first type of Ukrainians. When Putin joined the KGB in the beginning of the 1970s, he was surrounded by people who had Ukrainian ethnic origins. But they were not very different from the KGB officers from Russia or from Belarus. They had this maybe strange accent, or they may have this very specific family names, ending with or Huk. There's a traditional Ukrainian family names. But they were part of this great Russian Soviet community, and they would never argue that Ukraine should be sovereign and independent. But then there were those bad Ukrainians go against the Soviet rule. And they were, of course, immediately all fascists. So, and this distinction persists in different interpretations, in different contexts. I remember the Russian fascist ideologue Alexander Dugin in 2014 saying, well, where are those very strange people coming from? And he was commenting on the pro-European movement in Ukraine, also the start of the war. He would say, well, this is sort of a race of some bastards. And those are not Ukrainians, he said. I know Ukrainians, very nice people. Yeah, they're very friendly. But those, this race of bastards who came from sewers, they are not Ukrainians, they're not even humans. So when you look at the Ukrainian nation from this perspective of Russian political mythology, you have two parts of that. One is humanized through their friendly relations towards Russia or the Soviet Union. And the other part of Ukrainians is dehumanized through those fake, false associations with fascists that is considered to be universally political evil. So this is the basic, this is the core of the anti-Ukrainian sentiment.
Mhm. A quick follow-up question, I will request a brief answer maybe, but how do you think that this narrative was successful in trying to mobilize people in Russia for post invasion, or for the idea that Russia has the right to invade?
Very briefly, I must say that in contrast to the annexation of Crimea, which was welcomed and embraced by the Russian population in general, the full-scale invasion in 2022 was not demanded. There was no social demand for this invasion. It was the decision of Putin and the very close circle of his allies. It was then supported by quite significant parts of the population, but the decision itself was taken not because of the social demand, like probably the annexation of Crimea had that demand. And they did try to mobilize the population on this, so-called anti-fascism fight, but they were only partially successful, I would say. And much of the mobilization took place on not on ideological, not on these cultural grounds, but on the grounds of financial remuneration, or mobilizing people who otherwise don't really have any respected life in the very poor Russian regions. So I think this ideological mobilization was not the primary one.
So it will be more the economic aspect
Yes,
of it.
yes.
Mhm. Thank you. Now let's move to what's happening in Ukraine. Anastasia, the information manipulation and interference is also quite a big part of the cognitive war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. And how do you assess those campaigns centered on identity and history before and after the full-scale invasion? Those that were targeting people in Ukraine.
Yeah, so for myself, I did maybe not before full-scale invasion and after, but before the war. So before 2014, before annexation of Crimea and the occupation of Minsk Luhansk regions. And yes, after this time and till present days. But when we talk about times before the war, actually, I would say Russia, in my opinion, worked mostly on, I don't know, second Belarus scenario for Ukraine, or maybe even this episodes of Ukraine joining and becoming as a region of Russia. And it was mostly this narrative like, we are one people, we speak one Russian language, we have the same culture, the same history. Somewhere I would say maybe December 2013, so already Euromaidan started and so on. It was mostly directed to split Ukrainian society, because western part of Ukraine always consider, if you look in Russian media, like very aggressive towards Russians, and I think that they maybe not even have hope to win hearts of western Ukraine, would say, because they divide Ukraine into western and eastern And it has this historical resonance because western part of Ukraine joined USSR actually like completely after Second World War. So it was part of Poland before Hungary Empire and so on. And yeah, so I think that they managed at some point because, as Anton has already mentioned, in Crimea, we could see that the Russian population supported it a bit. And also Eastern Ukraine received, again, a lot of these narratives, we are one people, Nazis in Kiev, because Euromaidan is happening, we came to liberate you. And at the same time, like people globally see that there are no Russian people like people fighting in the National region and it's civil war. Would differ internationally and in Ukraine. And what we see like from this information, people from Western Ukraine, there were not so like identity narratives, but mostly about IDPs, internally displaced people coming to Lviv, for instance, burning one house and living, and people try to house them. Or they would hear something like people in Western Ukraine that your sons come and fight in Donbass when people from Donbass they just flee, they don't want to protect it. And like starting like from the full-scale invasion, Russia also had this attempts. So for instance, I remember times just like February, March 2022. On Telegram channels appeared many channels for different city, towns. For instance, you would see like news for Kyiv with Russian and Ukrainian flag, or only with Russian, only with Ukrainian flag. But they started posting such things like, Russian troops came to liberate you. And when Ukrainians saw this Russian, they already were very skeptical. So now I think Russia doesn't have so much influence on identity in Ukraine, but it's still a challenge on occupied territories and newly occupied territories too.
Also a quick follow-up question, but do you think that there were certain groups like age groups, for example, which were age demographics that were more susceptible to certain narratives, or rather not?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe of older generation, yes, because they have this USSR experience in the USSR introduction, and Russia also talks about it a lot. Like, we were so powerful, one nation, again, economic reasons for it, we were a so successful country. And probably also Russian-speaking people. I mean, some sound because Russia present narratives that, if you go to Western Ukraine to Lviv, you will be beaten or even killed if you speak Russian there, which is not true.
Just very briefly. I think this is an interesting conversation in terms of how Ukrainians themselves would probably interpret this narrative about liberation by the Russians, because this can be a powerful narrative. It certainly was in Crimea and Sevastopol, and also in some parts of eastern Ukraine. But what's interesting here as well is that full-scale invasion, I think, in a way, destroyed this narrative, or destroyed the efficiency of this narrative, because even compared to the Soviet times, where there was a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the leaders of the Soviet Union, however authoritarian or totalitarian they were, they actually had no problem with the existence of the Ukrainian culture and nation. While the full-scale invasion of Ukraine showed that Russia is not trying to create a friendly Ukraine. It would just destroy Ukraine. And if you look at those territories that they annexed, or officially annexed, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, they are not creating a country that will be sort of a pro-Russian Ukraine. No, they become Russian regions. Unlike the Soviet leaders who I'm not embracing, I'm not glorifying them, but even for them, the Ukrainian identity was not really a problem. They had a problem with the Ukrainian statehood and sovereignty, but not with the Ukrainian culture or even folklorized Ukrainian culture. But now even this folklorized Ukrainian culture is a problem for Putin regime. They're eliminating the Ukrainian nation and the Ukrainian state and making them Russia. They're not even playing. They're not even trying to play with multinational territory or whatever. No, it's just total annihilation, total elimination. This is why this narrative of liberation no longer works. They're not liberating, they're destroying.
And so, Sebastian, what do you think about all those narratives, including the narrative of liberation, peace, NATO being aggressive, and that before Russia invading? How powerful do you think are those narratives in the EU, in Western Europe, for example, in Germany or in Austria? And what role did actually this I would say propaganda of the time, the prior one, current one, how did it shape those narratives and perceptions of Russia in Europe?
I think they're very powerful. Otherwise, we wouldn't be discussing this so prominently. I think it's also one of the major successes that the Kremlin and the propaganda that comes out of the Kremlin has succeeded. That they actually amplify the sentiments that were there to a certain extent, but then also are able to adapt and see new possibilities to exploit that. For instance, if you look at Eastern Germany being as the GDR, also one of those liberated countries, and I lived and taught in Eastern Germany myself very briefly, and if you talk to the people, there is on the one hand this nostalgia for a state that never was there, but lives in their head, and especially also given to the next generation. It's like fantastic if you think about it, that people that are born in 1989 as students that were born in 1989 that were proud of their GDR heritage. And on the other hand, I mean, Russian soldiers were not, or USSR soldiers in the GDR were not something that would be welcomed and embraced as it is shown. But now they can still exploit that feeling because for whatever reason that memory was erased and is sort of replaced by a we've always been friends, we've always been anti-fascist. I mean, this was of course discourse of the SED, etc. But this anti-fascist protection wall that the Berlin Wall was, although people were killed at the border, etc. And it was actually the end of the free world. So this power to adapt, almost these Orwellian power to shape. No, we are no longer at war with what is it, Eurasia, but now it's Oceania. And this is really something that we can observe, and this is what I would believe is what makes it so powerful. This possibility to reshape this. And then there is, I mean, these underlying anti-Americanism that Anton has described, the sentiments that the Americans are the aggressors and the colonizers and the root of all evil in the world, etc., which you could debate, but I mean, we talk about great powers or wannabe great powers that do more or less the same thing with different means, and this is not the discussion that we are having. And so here, I would say this is the power to adapt and the anticipation to how to exploit things that come out of it. Well, we are not even anticipating that if we deny Ukraine that they can sign the association agreement, that it will spark the Euromodel.
I also wonder, what role do people who are not politicians but were in public affairs play in spreading this narrative? And I'm bringing it to you actually, Anton. Like, what about journalists, be it in Russia or in Europe, scholars, academics, but also people involved in culture. This also myth of great Russian culture and so on and so forth. What will they play in spreading and amplifying those narratives of Russia and the Kremlin?
Well, I hope I will not be stoned to death to say that Russian culture is a great culture. Like any other culture, it has its merit, it has its own merit, so to say, it has its own value. What is happening here is I teach a course on political warfare, and I consider those tactical propaganda and disinformation as just various parts of political warfare. In political warfare, everything can be weaponized. History can be weaponized. Energy dependence can be weaponized. Culture can be weaponized. The problem is not with culture itself. The problem is not with energy or trade or diplomacy or history itself, but about how you can weaponize it, how you can use those phenomena and those entities as weapons, as actual weapons in a war, in this case, political war. And of course, Russia is looking for friendly voices in the West. Russia is looking for people who would be susceptible to Russian narratives or pro-Kremlin narratives, pro-Putin narratives. It always finds those. In any society, there are people who, for one reason or another, for ideological reasons, for economic reasons, for the reasons of being contrary or anti-establishment, cult figures and influences, they would. Sorry?
Useful.
Some of them useful, some of those are actual agents who are paid. Useful idiots are not paid, they're doing everything for free. But there are people who are paid, not necessarily with money. You can pay them with access to things that are usually close to ordinary people, especially with journalists. As we know that for journalists, direct access to different figures and different materials is always great. This is something that is of huge value for journalists. And sometimes Russians are using this. Yes, you can have this access. And maybe you say something good about our great leader. The same with scholars, the same with people who may not necessarily be interested directly in money, but in information, in access, in having friendly relations with VIPs, so to say. So for every person, there is an approach, so to say. I'm sure some of you know that there is a kind of a rule how you recruit people, and and this rule is MICE or MICE. It's about money, ideology, compromising materials, ego. Sometimes there is a combination of those. So you can recruit people, you can recruit friendly scholars or academics or experts or politicians using money, or you can recruit them using ideological proximity. You can have compromising materials against them, the favorite Soviet compromat, or you can massage their ego, or you can have various combinations of those. But this is how, essentially, in general, recruitment for friendly voices works.
So thinking briefly about Alla Pugacheva, because she was very loved in Russia, but at the same time she fought against the Russian invasion and is now living in one of the Baltic states. In fact, she gave also an interview recently. Do you want to comment also on that?
Well, I haven't watched the interview, but I do know that Alla Pugacheva and her partner, husband, Maxim Galkin, they have been, especially him, in fact, they have been quite vocal in criticism of Russia's war against Ukraine. And it's actually interesting because Alla Pugacheva, she's like, in the Soviet Union, probably she was like a Madonna. Like a Soviet Madonna in a way, in terms of popularity. And she was and she's not a pop singer, you know. She's not a countercultural figure. She's not coming from the anti-establishment. She's part of the establishment, or she was part of the establishment. And then on the other hand, you have all those former Soviet rockers who always criticized the Soviet Union, who were, you know, coming from this, you know, underground and, you know, being vehement against authoritarianism, anti-authoritarianism. And some of them embraced, you know, being rock star, they embraced Putinism. And this, you know, this is odd, you know, this is some high level of irony that a pop star, you know, it has, you know, although I'm now sounding probably against pop music, but I'm not, but I'm just trying to give you this contrast between the music of protest that has to be protesting against the regime, and then pop singer, and they sort of change roles. You know?
Also feel free to comment on each other when your turn comes. I think we still have time for that. But Anastasia, I want to ask you, how did the full-scale invasion and this use of identity as a weapon of war affected Ukraine's own identity politics and nation building?
Yeah, it's actually affected a lot. So like Russian identity wars have been designed to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty by, I believe, denying completely Ukraine's nationhood. But it backfired. I think already in 2014, with the occupation of Crimea and annexation of Crimea and the occupation of the Donetsk region, it already backfired because look, now Ukrainian language is more popular. More people spoke Russian, yeah, before invasion, for instance. Now it's not so popular. Ukrainian language is kind of rising. Then it's like Ukrainian identity. People more identify with themselves with Ukraine, with its culture. Also, more people talk now about like political repressions in your society and understand it more. But so I see that there is like they try to understand again our history. So, for instance, in Ukraine, we don't celebrate any more 9th of May. It's Victory Day. We celebrate kind of 8th of May, so it's Day of Memory, Remembrance. So yeah, I believe it's backfired, and Ukraine now does great job also in promoting its identity, and also Ukrainians don't see it themselves with Russians. So also I see this not only like from people, but also on national level. For instance, we have this kind of foreign broadcasting channel, United 24, and he works on promoting Ukrainian identity as European, as diverse, and yeah, very opposite to Russian. So.
Sebastian, you have recently published an op-ed on our IDM blog. The title was "Without a Just Peace, There is Just Peace." Well, given the idea of peace, that peace has been appropriated by Russian propaganda, as we were already talking, how do you think Ukraine as an international community should articulate this peace, this call for peace, in such a way that it's not co-opted by Russia?
Well, I mean, it has a long-standing tradition. Yeah? Anton mentioned those peace movements, yeah, under the disguise that it was USSR propaganda, and it's basically the same, where we can see that there is these peace discussions, and stopping the war and every life saved is important. Yeah, of course. Who would not subscribe to that? But the challenge here is, and that goes in line with what Anastasia just had described, that Ukraine has its own identity that is so dominant now that there is no other choice than erasing this, because there will never be a possibility to sort of put the genie back into the bottle. It's out there now, and we have finally also in Western Europe understood that Ukraine is not some sort of annex to Russia, but it has its own culture, identity, language, etc. So what the challenge is when we talk about peace is now that we will not have a sustainable peace, or this play on words that functions in the English language, that if we don't have a just peace, there will be just peace, which means sooner or later, the conflict will flare up again and to turn most likely into a full-scale war again as just now. And this, by the way, is also a discussion that is ongoing in the Russian Federation. So they say if we give Ukraine the time to have a ceasefire now, they will use it to be powered up and armed by NATO, and then they will attack and take back the territories. If this is true or not, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, it means that in all of the possibilities with this, having a ceasefire or having no more fighting, having some sort of peace, it's absolutely clear that this will be temporary. Unless we have proper, and this is the just or the justice aspect of a just peace, unless we have, first of all, security guarantees for Ukraine, that something like this cannot happen again. How we do that, if that is NATO, if that is EU, if that is something else, that would need to be explored, but this is one of the core conditions. The second thing is, of course, there's almost 150,000 cases of war crimes documented. They need to be brought to justice, and it's fairly clear who committed them and is committing them while we speak. There are war crimes being committed. We could open the Air Alert app and we'll see that there are war crimes being committed right now as we speak. And if we don't bring this to justice, it will be very hard to tell the Ukrainian people, look, you just have to accept that this is whatever the peace order will be. Because without justice, this will just also contribute to flare up again and turn into a full-scale war again. And then there's other aspects to it that you could discuss. You mentioned United 24. They did actually just now a campaign again, where you could send in what you think is just peace, but they also have I think from January of this year. And there are like things that Ukrainians answered, which I find very moving, simple sense, like what is a just peace? I can use a train line again from Kiev to Zaporizhia. If I can return to some sort of normal life that I had before, because what we also don't discuss really is that many lives have been put on hold. They are frozen in time. For many, it's in 2014, or for even more, it's since February 2022. And this is something, when it comes to education, possibilities, travel abroad. Now the borders have been open for males 18 to 22, but all these things you cannot do this. Go to a pop concert or to an indie rock concert, doesn't matter. You can't do it because you cannot leave your country. Things like this. And this, I would say, is also an aspect of returning justice to Ukraine.
You were also already talking about concrete actions that should be taken and could be taken. This brings me to my last question, which is about what can be done to address and counter the exploitation of history and culture by Russia. Like, how do we address the weaponization of history and culture? That is, at the international level, in Ukraine and also in Russia. So please, you can cover all of it, but you can also pick like one of those aspects. Who would like to start?
Let me mention that if we're talking about defending ourselves from the weaponization of history, I say that offense is the best defense. And there is this phenomenon which I can't really understand why it is not being used wider. And this phenomenon is based on the fact that you already mentioned September 1939, the Soviet Union started Second World War together with the Third Reich by destroying the Polish state. The Soviet Union is was as criminal as the Third Reich. The Soviet regime killed millions of people. I'm not even talking about the Holodomor, the genocide by famine in the 1920s and 1930s. The communist ideology, in the end, because it's in many countries, it lasted more than fascist regime. It killed more people than fascists historically in the 20th century. We have not seen the decommunization on the level of at least Europe the same way as denazification took place in Western Europe and especially in Germany. Unfortunately, there was no decommunization after the GDR was joined to the rest of Germany. We are not using enough these facts. We are not weaponizing history enough in order to defend ourselves. Russians, they like to present the Soviet Union as the liberator of Central Eastern Europe. It was not liberating Central Eastern Europe. This is the reason why I'm not celebrating the 8th of May. There is nothing to celebrate. It was a liberation for West Europe, but it was an enslavement for the peoples of Central Eastern Europe and Nordic countries such as the Baltic states. For decades, they had to endure the Soviet rule, the Soviet occupation. That was not liberation. We should call this phenomena as they are. That was not liberation. That was occupation and enslavement by the Soviet Union. This is something that the Putin regime really hates. In fact, when people are raising those historical questions of the Soviet Union being as criminal as the Third Reich. We should use this. We should use this more widely. Of course, now in the European Union, there is a commemoration day in August, I think 23rd of August. Yes, so it's linked to the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939 about the division of Europe into spheres of influence of the Soviet Union and the Third Reich, and even that commemoration day is called about victims of Nazism and Stalinism. They're not even mentioning Sovietism or communism. They're still sticking to this, the Stalin problem. No, the Soviet ideology was the problem. The Soviet ideology that was the ideology of occupation. We should talk more about this. And as I mentioned, I think this is the counteroffensive, and this is the offense that is the best defense.
You mean when you say we should talk about it, you mean here in Europe?
We should have a tribunal, against the Soviet crimes against humanity in Europe. We should have it. We had a tribunal, the Nuremberg trials against the crimes of the Third Reich, but we never had the tribunal against the Soviet crimes, although they were there, but they were just forgiven because the Soviet Union was one of the victims of the Second World War. But it was a criminal regime, it was a criminal state that committed war crimes and continued to commit those crimes against Europe after the end of the Second World War.
I think this perception of the Soviet Union also different between the Western and Eastern countries, because if you think about the terror Haza in Budapest, it actually shows, or used to show at least, how both regimes committed same crimes in how many ways they were comparable. This is also the approach that many countries, Poland, Baltic states also have.
And I can link this argument to what Sebastian you said about just peace. The peace of 1945 was not just peace. It was not just for Central Eastern Europe, because they were occupied. And that injustice in 1945, I think, in my opinion, in many ways led to the turmoil, the geopolitical turmoil well, that we are having today.
Anastasia, would you also imply such measures as Anton, or how do you think we should counter organizational identity?
I completely agree with Anton, and I also think it's this counter-offensive and defensive. It's also worth recognition, because I believe when we talk about specific crimes, many states now recognize Holodomor in Ukraine as genocide. Yes, but we also need to talk about Central Asia. Holodomor happened also there, or in Belarus. So for me, it's also recognition of these crimes, and plus with what will be done in Russia. And in this case, I believe, like without changing of regime, probably nothing. Because, for instance, what Russia does now, they had NGO Memorial, which was established to actually investigate these political crimes of USSR. Now its activity just prohibited. Also, a set of new repression laws right now is working because, and they are all against the informational space. So in Russia now, if before it worked like you cannot post extremist materials, now you cannot search extremist materials. And more things like this, also many cases of internet shutdown for a couple of days in some regions. So like, probably nothing we can change without changing regime.
Sebastian, the last word goes to you.
Reconciliation is also something that will be very important. And I think, I mean, I understand that you don't want to celebrate the Liberation Day on 8th of May, or maybe we celebrate Europe Day. And then and it's of course a utopia at the moment, but I think that one of the major achievements of European integration is the reconciliation aspect, especially when it comes to Germany and France. And this would be something that you would have to have afterwards. So after you bring this, a lot of very challenging steps in between. Russia needs to lose that war. There must be a just peace, and then you can have proper decolonialization, and then you can have reconciliation. But I would add to this what I subscribe to what Anton and Anastasia have said, but you would also have to see that in this kind of hopefully developing positive future that something like this happens, because it will not go away geographically, but we need to get rid of this expansionist, genocidal, fascist tendencies that are looming in the Russian society. And if we don't address this, then, well, it won't just disappear with Putin or with the current mafia regime in Moscow.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems that we have to very much rethink the past, also here, but also the perception of the past of the Soviet Union, because things that, or events, tragic events, which are obvious in Central and Eastern Europe, are not necessarily perceived the same way in Western Europe. And also, when you mentioned that there was never decommunization, this is very true. I find that even if the war ends, but the regime doesn't change, or the regime changes slightly, there will be a continuation of it because the society will still actually believe in those narratives. We'll be now bringing our two speakers from the Research Center of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine for their brief comments. In the meantime, I will take a look at the room, and could you just signal if anyone has a question or willing to have a question? Okay, then after Verkhovna Rada, okay. Two questions are in the room. Could you go both speakers? Very good. Hello, great to see you. Thank you for joining us. So it's Mr. Alexander Kolosov and Andy Tokam from the Research Center of the Verkhovna Rada. We would like to know your comments and remarks on today's topic, on today's discussion.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is.
Sorry, we have some technical problems.
Can you hear me?
We can't hear you yet. Just give us a second. We're trying to see what's on our side.
Again.
Could you say something?
All right. Can you hear me?
I think I can hear you.
Do you hear?
Yeah.
Yes, you do.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, all right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kolos Alexander. I'm the Chief Scientific Consultant for the Department of National Security and Law and Order of Research Service of Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. I'm so happy and appreciate to be here. This is really important event for us, and thank you so much for your support, that you support Ukraine, that you support our country in during this difficult time and challenges for all of us. And this event is really important because of what's happening. This is unbelievable. Because what Russia is doing in Ukraine is just disgusting, and this is really important and crucial issue for us. And when when we're talking about the war, we should understand where everything started and began, because I remember when, starting from 2014, we were talking about so-called hybrid war. And actually I was a university student back then, and I was trying to figure out what was it actually, hybrid war, because there are different definitions, there are different concepts of hybrid war in the world. And actually today, especially for this event, I would like to share with you with some of my personal ideas based on the foreign knowledge of American and European scientists of hybrid war. Because when we are fighting something, when we're trying to, we should understand the core, the essence of the problem. And that's why I think that this is really important to define the issue, the concept of hybrid war internationally, and to embed this in national law as well. And actually, I propose to divide this problem into three different divisions or sections. First of all, we should talk about the hybrid threat, because everything starts from hybrid threat. Then we're talking about military conflict, and then we're talking about the hybrid war. So, and I proposed some kind of definition of hybrid threat, which was a state characterized by activation of various kinds of criminal, separatist, and terrorist groups within a targeted country, which are supported by a third-party destabilizing actor, whose activities are aimed at destabilizing the political, economic, and social situation within that country in favor of the third party, for the third party to achieve its political and other goals in conditions of real possibility of a military conflict between warring parties. And then hybrid conflict, which is an armed clash of low and medium intensity, which is accompanied or may be accompanied by cyber attacks between criminal, separatist, or terrorist groups supported by the destabilizing actor and a targeted country, defending country. And then we are coming to the hybrid war. So in this three-layer approach, I decided to define hybrid war as well. And that was, I remember, 2015, 2016, when actually this article was published. And it's a funny story. On behalf of the article was published because the publisher didn't have much space for the article, but it's a sad story, all right. And I defined the hybrid war is like a higher stage of hybrid conflict, which is escalated state characterized by a high intensity armed clash between its actors or involving direct military involvement, direct intervention by an aggressor in such a conflict without a declaration of war. Besides direct intervention, military involvement is also defined as overt or covert subversive activities of an aggressor regular forces against a targeted country. And I remember when I was talking about this at my university, because there was a whole conference devoted to the scientific works. And I was talking about this in 2017, 2018, and actually nobody suspected that it would happen in a in real life for real, and unfortunately it happened. So that's why I was talking about this, that this is really important to legislate this issue of hybrid war, to prevent and combat these threats in the real time and in the future. And I think that the event that we're holding today is a really crucial and important part for us. To understand more about the Russian-Ukrainian war and the so-called hybrid wars in general, because this will, I think, may prevent and all of the threats, and will provide us with the specific tools for our security, not only Ukraine, but the European security in general. As far as you understand, and you can see that this issue actually it spreads everywhere, and that's why we should be standing together in this fight, and this is really important for us, and we really appreciate your input and your support for our country. And I think that my colleague Andriy will tell you more about, he will share with his ideas about hybrid war and his personal thoughts and opinion. Andriy, I'm giving the floor to you. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Can you hear me well?
We can hear very well, but we have slight problem with our speakers. We could speak extra loud. We can hear
okay.
you.
Okay, that's no problem. First, I'd like to thank you for your work according Russian political mythology and the war in Ukraine, because for us, as Alexander said, it's extremely important right now, because that's not only about researching some history or mythology. It's about the war, and as we call it, informational frontline, because the war is not only about fighting on the front line. It's also about, and I would like to agree, as it was mentioned, that the best offense is the best defense, according informational warfare. And I am happy that today we speak so much about informational war, about hybrid wars, about Russian propaganda, and we defend the truth, because as it was also mentioned today, the actual war or hybrid war started since 2014, and I saw all of this with my own eyes, because my hometown was actually occupied in 2014, and since then, as Alexander also mentioned, but this was hybrid war. It was very complicated, and even some people in Ukraine didn't understand what actually happened there, because in 2022 we have a full-scale invasion, and everything is clear that Russia is our enemy and we need to defend our country. But in 2014 the things were so complicated that, for example, in Donbas region there were created so-called independent Luhansk and Donetsk people republics, and we as a people who lived there, we knew that it was all supported by Russian forces, and it was all about Russian occupation. But even some people in Ukraine didn't know this, and people all around the world didn't know how to react to this. Some people considered this as a local, some Ukrainian conflict. And I am very happy that today we have the whole international community speaking about Ukraine, speaking about how we need to offense Russian propaganda and protect Europe. And that's important that we understand the patterns of propaganda, because Russians spread their propaganda through history, through literature, through media, and it always repeats the same messages. For example, denying Ukrainian identity, projecting Russians' own war crimes into others, and claiming violence as defense. And if we recognize this pattern, we can answer faster and more effectively. And this is extremely important for international cooperation, because disinformation does not stop at borders. If we want to win this battle, we need to share knowledge, share methods, and support each other as we do. And thank you again for this work, and I hope we'll work together again.
Alexander, Andre, thank you very much. It's our pleasure to organize this event and organizing also other events like that in the future. Thank you very much for bringing this topic of hybrid threats. We didn't address it explicitly today, but it is a challenge that we also experience very much in Europe in very different manifestations. And I think there's a lot that we in Europe can learn actually from Ukrainians and how to face that challenge. And identity wars definitely belongs to it. And also, as you mentioned, people in Ukraine very often didn't realize themselves that hybrid war was also happening, because it can happen without even stating declaring a war. And sometimes we have a feeling that it comes from within the country, whereas it might be planted there from abroad. Thank you very much. Dear audience, you've been very patient. Now it's your turn for your questions and comments. We still have around 15 minutes, so I would rather ask for questions. And I saw there were already 3 people who wanted to ask a question. I saw the first one here, then in the row behind, and then here in the first row. Please, I know you, but others may not. So briefly state who you are and then ask your question. Also say who you are directing at.
Yeah. This is a general question. I'm Harold Otto. I'm an editor here in Vienna. I noticed you have a contribution called Putinism Against Ukraine. Why isn't the book called Putinism Against Ukraine?
Would you be there to collect questions as well?
And to kind of follow up on that,
Uh-huh.
Hope the guy, I assume Putin is mortal. What's going to happen after he doubles off the stage? And how will Russia be de-Putinized?
Actually, I had a remark, not a comment. I'm not allowed, I was speaking.
Is it a brief remark?
Okay, that's
Yeah. There's one,
My name is Günther Fellinger. I'm the chairman of the Austrian Committee for NATO enlargement for Ukraine and Austria. That's the only way for peace. That's my statement. I have a question to Anastasia. The whole start of the things has happened in the beginning when the collapse of the Soviet Union came, and the succession of Russia in the Security Council with a veto power. We basically gave the right to Russia to dominate the global governance again. Do you think that was a tragic mistake? And my question to Anton, you are the most famous author of a very famous fundamental book for Austrian political science, which is Hanko Noya, this documentation of the Russian undermining of the Austrian political system with money, especially in the extreme right-wing party in the FPÖ. Maybe it's time for a second edition for this. And maybe you can underline a little bit and outline a little bit how especially the FPÖ has written the pro-Russian narrative, especially in neutrality, to defend neutrality and all these other things which have recently happened with Mr. Masalek. Many other scandals we have seen by Russia is actually buying influence in Austria.
and there's one question there. That was first.
Yes, also with regard to Bodensteiner, a former German diplomat, this a couple of years in Russia as well as in the Balkans. With regards to the hybrid war Russia is leading against the West and maybe against Austria in particular, what would you recommend? I read a lot of good analysis, but I seldom read what to do practically against it. There are organizations, NGOs, I know who are doing this, but I think the governments should be more active and do something more openly and practically whenever such propaganda gets into the main news, the government should react more clearly. But what other measures would you suggest to do to combat this hybrid war?
We got our questions. There are actually more than 3 questions. Remarks, I just want to say you can always also talk about remarks like after the event, so no worries. You will be heard. Okay, who would like to start?
Well, the title, I think it's very easy. Well, that was Putin against Ukraine. That is just one of the chapters. but the collective effort is not only about Putin. Although my own chapter is about Putin, but the collective effort is about Russia against Ukraine. So this is hence the title. In fact, you mentioned that Putin is mortal. My chapter is about immortality, symbolic immortality of Putin. And as sort of his quest for the symbolic immortality through this war. Some of my friends on the Russian opposition side probably would be not be happy of my position, but I don't think that Russia is going to democratize. I don't see any reasons why you should do so, especially given the international context. Democracy is in retreat globally, and I see no point why Russia would suddenly start democratizing. The trend is different. The global trend is not about democratization, and I can't imagine that Russia, after Putin decided to go against the trend and start democratizing in spite of the authoritarian trend. So it will remain authoritarian, but hopefully its authoritarianism will not necessarily be internationally aggressive. Yeah, there are countries which are authoritarian, and they are not as threatening their neighbors as some other authoritarian states are doing. So I don't see a democratic Russia anytime soon. As for this, I did write a book almost 10 years ago about the relation between Russia and the far right in the West, mostly in Europe. It was not only about Austria, it was about some other European countries as well. But as a technicality, I was suggested to write a second edition, not a new book, but a second edition with some additions to the already existing books. It's just I was involved in several other projects, and it's not a priority at the moment, so to say. Of course, there are many things to say, many things to add. For example, the developments in the rise of Germany and their links to Russia are most prominent, and they were not the ones writing the book several years ago.
Answering to Günther's question, I think it brings us again to Anton's point that decommunizations never happened. Actually, and Russia receives this veto power because what considers Russia to be a winner of the Second World War, and also because Russia is considered to be an successor of USSR and not any other of 15 republics. Yeah, so of course now it's a tragic mistake.
Would you like?
Yeah, I can only echo. It's not only Putin. And what will follow is not going to be better. So we're in for worse. I would unfortunately believe. I also just briefly, I can't say we want just peace and then we don't adhere to international law. So if there was this acceptance that the Russian Federation is the legal successor, okay. But the right question you would have to ask in this case is it still contemporary that we have 5 veto powers in the UN Security Council? I think this is the better question than if this was a tragic mistake, because you could go back and say, like, wasn't it a tragic mistake that we gave to the People's Republic of China, that they have a veto power in the UN Security Council, which was done 4 years later. Anyway, I think one of the very crucial questions, and this is a very good question, how to counter that, that hybrid war that is there. I think the first and foremost important thing is to understand that there is a hybrid war, because most of the time we don't acknowledge that. We think like, oh, it's free speech. We have to accept all opinions. We cannot do anything if there is the spread of fake news and disinformation. And this is the one of the major points that we would have to go against. And I think that the European Union, with tendencies to overstep in certain points, but would have the capacity to actually implement it. And then, I mean, we would say, okay, it used to function that you would be called out if you spread lies, and then you would say, no, this is the end of your, you know, public opinion career, political career, etc. This does not function anymore, so there's something fundamentally wrong with this. So we actually have to counter these kind of things. And one of the major parts, of course, what we could do with regards to news, national media outlets is to better supervise if outlets that obviously spread fake news and disinformation are getting public funding. And this is something that is happening in Austria, that there are outlets that spread lies, and I'm not even talking about the Kronenzeitung. But no, there's worse outlets that spread fake news, that amplify these kind of voices and get public funding. And this is something that we would have to reform and would have to question. How is it possible that that this is something that we are not doing as a sovereign democratic semi-enlightened state?
We also have one more question from the chat, but so Anastasia would like to comment.
Yeah, I would like to comment to add. I agree with you, but I also believe that European Union, or it's not Russia, yes, so it can close information space and say people what to believe to. So it's also our job to work with people in the European Union, because policymakers, parties, see the country voters. So yeah, it's also our work of Ukraine to try to explain more, maybe try to win hearts in a way. Yeah.
There's a there's a question. There's a question about Austria as well in hybrid war. I believe I can address it to all of you. To what extent is Austrian neutrality enabling Russia's hybrid warfare across Europe?
It's not to, especially as I'm a guest in this country, I don't want to diminish the importance of Austria, but I think that when it comes to the overall importance of a debate of neutrality, I think it's more of an internal debate than a European. We have seen that countries are willing to give that up as a process, not overnight. Countries that have joined the EU together with Austria, that have made these steps. It's not something that is something that will happen very soon, but there is already also a certain discussion that has also politically started. And maybe it just takes a little bit more time. But of course, it's one of the narratives that influences and amplifies Russian point of views. And these are entry points. And you know, once you start to believe in these certain narratives, it's easy to go down into that rabbit hole, and then it's very difficult to get oneself out of it. So there's an entry point, I would say, with this narrative in Austria, but its significance of this debate for the broader European security is minor.
So maybe also that Russia is actually recognizing, we use this word so often today, Austrian neutrality, not neutrality, much more than actually this can be an issue in reality. You would agree? Do you want to add something also?
I'll add something. When we're talking about Austria's neutrality, I think we are confusing two different things. One is neutrality, political neutrality and overall neutrality, and Austria is not neutral. It is part of Western alliances. More importantly, it's part of the European Union. It is a military neutral state. Yes, basically meaning that it's not part of NATO. But at the same time, it's not neutrality of Austria that is being used as an entry point. No, in Austria, I believe the problem is not neutrality per se, but the how's it put it, unhygienic efforts of some business companies to work with Russia and provide them with opportunities to expand not only in Austria but also in Europe in general. Yeah, so and they are driven not by neutrality, not this by idea of neutrality. It doesn't really matter. They are driven by greed. They are driven by their economic benefit. So per se, neutrality is not a problem. I'm sure that if there is a wider war effort in Europe, a wider European war, Austria is not going to be on the neutral in a neutral position. I just don't believe in this.
Depends when it comes and which government, yeah.
True, but I still don't think that Austria would be neutral. It's even geographically, it's. I think it's not as neutral as some people like.
This sounds like a topic for the next discussion.
Maybe also with some Austrian representatives.
Exactly. I think our speakers should receive really a big round of applause. Anton, Sebastian, Anastasia, Alexandra, and Andrei, thank you very much for all your insights. Also sharing very often your personal stories and experiences. There is a lot that I'm taking personally from this discussion, from rethinking history through why wasn't Russia actually the communized, to actually a call for action, right? So I wouldn't maybe say that we should be more offensive, but that we should act more. Not be reactive, but active, because offensive weaponization, this sounds to me too much like also what Russia does, but let's put it more domestically, I would.
Very open, we should project more strength and less weakness.
There we go. And with this sentence, I would like to finish this event. Thank you very much for joining us here. Thank you very much for joining us online. If you enjoy this discussion, if you like to learn more about Ukraine, but also about Central and Eastern Europe, we're talking that sometimes the knowledge about this region might be a little bit small, and the goal of our institute, and only of ours, also the Center for Democratic Integrity and the Research Center of Verkhovna Rada, is actually to provide you with reliable, valuable knowledge about the region. So if you like our event, please join our newsletter. Consider becoming a member. There are also some forms lying there. There is also a lot of other magazines of ours that are free to take. So please take it, learn more about us, and also Anton.
Yeah, just one technical point. So the audience present here, offline, so to say, can take a copy of this publication, and the online audience can just Google the name of the publication. It's also available on the website of the Center for Democratic Integrity, this NGO that I run, and which is providing an analysis of authoritarian regimes trying to influence politics in Europe, and it's also available for free online. But there is also a page, the last page of this audio, where you have QR codes. You can donate to the Center for Democratic Integrity so that we can continue our research, including about the war against Ukraine.
So thank you very much, and I look forward to meeting you during other events. Thank you for seeing who was here, for everything in the background.
Yeah, and sorry for the technical problems. I did not manage to solve them, but what does and then be in that I think.